Now we are moving to the next section, part 4 of the book, which is called Nature-Based Solutions. Oops, here. Governance, Planning and Value. Anything we look at, especially adaptation, lots of noise about climate change impacts, what will happen in 2100, but unless adaptation is mainstreamed into fiscal policy, budget processing, and finances are kept aside for sustaining actions, implementations, planning, governance, and so on, it'll be a failure, especially because we are dealing with risks that are uncertain, and there are many interests that will delay actions at any small excuse they can find. So these are very important issues in the context that we are talking about. So here the chapters, I will just jump to chapter 11. So chapter 10 here is on planning and maintaining nature-based solutions, lessons for foresight, sustainable care from Berlin, Jakarta, Melbourne, and Santiago, Chile. So the art is showing, obviously, again our favorite image of nature-based solution implemented so beautifully in a city with all sorts of green spaces, exposure places, education, outreach spaces, walkable spaces, and gardens being maintained. And you have here a nice citizen group, community-based organization or stakeholders engaged in determining the rules and regulations on planning and maintaining nature-based solutions. So these are lessons for foresight and sustainable care. So they have shown elderly people here just to talk about that. So that's about all I'll say about this chapter. The following chapter, again, looking at chapter 11 again. So here we are looking at the art that is for a chapter on governance of and with nature-based solutions in cities. Again, you see here stakeholders showing us good social mix, getting together and doing the planning and governance of the nature-based solutions and governance of the city with nature-based solutions. People enjoying, as usual, biodiversity being discussed, and you have younger people sitting here with street map designs and building designs and so on. So you have obviously nature-based solutions themselves and governance being discussed here. So obviously, and you see this nice art of two hands or few hands meeting together. Social cohesion, stakeholder engagement and participation, agency for people to actually participate, and of course we cannot forget our biodiversity and other things as well. So I won't say more again from this chapter. So let's jump to this is of course chapter 11, which is on governance of and with nature-based solutions. Operationalization of inclusive governance of and with nature-based solutions in cities. A schematic showing how the steps have to be followed to make sure that we have effective and inclusive and efficient governance of and with nature-based solutions in cities. You have to establish nature-based solutions with planning, strategizing, implementing, financing, everything. Then you have to maintain it. So you have to govern the city itself with nature-based solutions, and you have to govern the nature-based solutions themselves, right? So those are the two things being pointed out. Inclusive governance of and with nature-based solutions. Cross-sectoral inclusivity we are talking about here, not just in terms of different socioeconomic and ethnic groups, but also cross-sectoral. So people from industries, from businesses, firms, whatever else. Multi-species inclusivity, intergenerational inclusivity. So you have young people, let's say here, doing something, younger people doing governance, older people here doing governance of the nature-based solutions and of the city itself. Epistemological inclusivity. So epistemology is basically the generation of knowledge, so that you have indigenous knowledge, corporate memory, and long-term residents giving you ideas on what the governance issues are, and spatial inclusivity as well. Who is included in implementing NBS? From which sector? So experts in science policy, experts from science policy, planning, market, business, and or community, question mark. Who represents nature as a stakeholder or a more than human perspective, so that you not only worry about people but also multi-species, so that we looked at here, all the species that are essential at various levels for the functioning of the ecosystem itself. Are all age groups represented? Who represents children and youth and elderly? Whose knowledge is included? So that's epistemological inclusivity. Are different forms of knowledge included? Knowledge may be about ecology, about technology, about social cohesion, and social scientists in general are not getting as much engagement. Climate science, climate change impacts is dominated by physical scientists and so-called natural scientists, STEM scientists, who are actually climate pathologists. They can tell you what's going wrong, but they are not the doctors. They are not the ones to fix it, right? So we have to worry about that a little bit, especially for the global south and countries like India. Who benefits from the special transformation of NBS? Whose relation with space is altered? So whenever you do interventions like these, it's nature-based solution, but it's still an intervention. So who benefits and whose relation is altered? Okay, so chapter 12 here. Let me cheat again and look at the book. I'm not remembering everything as I should, because this is the first time I'm teaching it. Once you teach a few times, you begin to remember things much better. So this is about mapping, measuring, and valuing the benefits of nature-based solutions in cities. So measuring, of course, you have the big scale here with all the human habitats, and you have on this side measuring ecology, biodiversity, mental health impacts, economic benefits, well-being benefits, impacts of preserving biodiversity, and so on and so forth. We have few ideas to discuss in this chapter as well. Common urban ecosystem services and their supply of benefits to people living in cities, along with examples of potential metrics to value those services and methods for quantifying those values. That's a long sentence. Common urban ecosystem services and their supply of benefits to people living in cities, along with examples of potential metrics to value those services and methods for quantifying those values. Okay, so I read it again. There you go. So ecosystem services include things like climate change mitigation, so includes carbon sequestration, emissions reductions, air pollution improvement, water quality as well, urban cooling, stormwater retention, flood mitigations, coastal and pluvial, coastal sea level rise, storm surge inundation, river getting overrun with heavy rain, coastal hazard mitigation, recreation, physical activity and health, mental health and biodiversity. Going back to the supply metric, I won't read all of them. Carbon stored or sequestered. Value metrics can be social cost of carbon and carbon market price. These are kind of tricky as well. Social cost of carbon is basically what is the impact of each additional ton of carbon on some metric of social impact. Very tricky to compute because there are a lot of assumptions that go in. Discount rate, if you don't know what that is, you can look at other podcasts I have on that, and so on. What is the carbon market price? This also depends on how it's done, top down, bottom up, permits given out, bottom price set for the permits, and so on. And you have urban cooling, where you're looking at, of course, air temperature, which can have value metrics in terms of productivity, climate emissions, private costs of cooling with air conditioning, and so on, and impacts on mortality and morbidity. Value modeling approach can include net present value of change in damages from carbon emissions, change in total revenue from sale of carbon credits, and in urban cooling, you have loss of workplace productivity as a result of temperature and humidity if you're not doing proper mitigation measure with nature-based cooling, less in this context. Increased emissions from cooling, or heating from air conditioners and so on, and cost of carbon, so social cost and market price. Private cost of cooling, of course, cost of cooling itself on energy or heating, and it goes up and down with temperatures. And mortality and morbidity include a relative risk of mortality and morbidity as a function of temperature and region. Okay, so there are similar details in other ecosystem services we are worried about. Which one should I read? Maybe recreation. So the metric would be access, distance to park, and park attributions. The metrics would be number of visitors to park and housing prices affected by access to park, for example. Schools can be another big factor, but we are talking about nature-based solutions here. So the valuation modeling approach can rely on entry or use fees, willingness to pay by people, and the travel cost to get to the park. It relates to distance to park, and hedonistic pricing or hedonic pricing in terms of how valuable it is to people, and can you charge more, not necessarily related to just the investment, but the benefits and perceived benefits, people's value for access to park and so on. So similarly, mental health, let's read this. Access to urban nature, for example, views of greenery, distance to parks, amount of trees in the neighborhood itself, and the value metrics will be mental health indices like health quality and heat island metrics, and avoided cost of treatment. And here valuation modeling can be done with relative risk of mental illness, change in subjective well-being, so how people themselves perceived the value, and change in costs associated with treatment to restore original mental health levels. So if you moved in and feel stresses, or you moved from a neighborhood with no access to urban nature to a neighborhood, and so on. So we have to treat these with the caveats, but again, social cultural values themselves often are associated with how that community values access to urban nature and positive impacts on mental health and well-being, psychological well-being, and so on. So there are other examples from this chapter looking at embedded carbon. So this is the current landscape and residential scenarios with increased greenness. So carbon in embedded emissions from the manufacture and construction of built infrastructure here, and without a built infrastructure. So you can see here in grams of carbon, so this is megagrams carbon per pixel. Okay, so just see that you increase obviously the embedded carbon as you change the area. So you're looking here with and without wetland. So this is with wetland and this is without wetland. Okay, so annual increase in mental health expenditures also change. There are places where there is no data. So this is distance to a green area, let's say with 1200 meters. So there are many details that I'm not going to get into, but this is the annual increase in mental health treatment expenditures expected without the wetland. So very specific metric is used, how the wetland is impacting mental health expenditure. Hard metric, but very important metric as well. Okay, so I think I will leave this here. I'm reading things rather fast, but hopefully it's still very clear, and hopefully you can go back to the book and read the details if this topic is of interest, because I'm skipping many details which are important, but my goal is not to get into those details, but to give you a start of the overview of the book itself, each section, and then you can follow up if you find this to be of interest, or if this is part of your deeper research and so on. Okay, see you in the next section.